In this lecture, I'm going to be talking to you about access control. Remember that last time I talked to you about password security and the importance of choosing a strong password in order to protect your profile, and the fact that passwords are a first line of defense for any social media platform or application that you might be using. We look at access control, but in particular discretionary access control, because discretionary access control says that I, as the user, have the power to decide whom to grant or not to grant access to my information. So if we recall about password security, I said that you need this in order to protect your social media account from hacking, and that in general what you want to protect is your personal identification information, because this says a lot about you that can be used to reconstitute a personality that is very similar to yours and used to do things that you would not otherwise do. And we said that it's important therefore to choose a strong password, and we looked at methods of how you would choose a strong password. With access control, what we want is basically to define a set of rules or policies, as it's sometimes called, to handle access to data systematically. So you want to grant certain users access to be able to modify certain bits of information. For example, on Wikipedia, you all modify a single sheet of information to write different sorts of things on this sheet, for example. Basically, what happens in terms of the rules is that you have rules to grant access, you have rules to revoke access, you have rules to delete or to modify information, and all of these operations are meant to combinedly allow you to handle access to the data in ways that you, as the user who owns the data, wants this to happen. So, for example, what you might do is to say, for example, on Facebook, that certain users who are your friends are allowed to see pictures about you with your family. But other users who are, for example, your work colleagues are not allowed to access this information. And therefore, you need to have segments or compartments in order to put users into these different categories in order to avoid overlapping access. In terms of access on social media, and what I said earlier is that you have a specific variant of access control that is discretionary. Discretionary access control basically says that instead of depending on a central security administrator, every user becomes their own security administrator and decides how and what it is to do with their own information. So basically, the access is controlled on the basis of the subject or the person with whom the user is interacting with. So the identity of the user, that the user is interacting with, is very important in deciding what sorts of access rules to define with respect to some object or with respect to some bit of information that the user is trying to access. Okay. The user, because they own the object, can constrain how it is read, how it is modified, and how it is deleted. Okay? There are other names for discretionary access control. So some of them are, for example, identity-based access control, some authorization-based access control. All of what all of these names are saying is that the user is king. You can decide whom to grant access to your information to, and you can decide whom not to grant access to your information to. Okay. The advantage of the discretionary access control scheme, or identity-based access control scheme, as you might decide to call it, is that it is simple to use, it's flexible. So think about, for example, how you grant access to people. For example, on Facebook, you have categories of friends you really, really like, friends whom you don't really like, and friends whom you pretend to like. And you have everybody in these different categories, and they don't know that they belong in these categories, but they all have the perception of being able to communicate with you in ways that you have controlled and decided. Okay. The disadvantage of discretionary access control is that there is no formal assurance concerning information flow. For example, if you post a picture and your really, really good friend has access to this picture, and your really, really good friend is friends to your friend who is not your so really, really good friend, your not so really, really good friend can have access to the picture that you thought was private to your really good friend. Okay? And the way that this happens is because if your really good friend is not doing something right in terms of defining access control policies, they can inadvertently grant access to information that you have posted to people whom you would not like this information to be made accessible to. The second really great disadvantage is of Trojan horse attacks. Trojan horse attacks encompass anything from, for example, clicking on like for photographs, and these likes having, for example, malware embedded in the photograph or in the application that you like. Third-party applications, for example, that you try to access, so for example, gaming applications that then result in your having malicious software on your system that do anything from stealing private information to, for example, reporting information about how you use the system and using that information later on for things like spying and advertising that we talked about. Examples for discretionary access control is that you need, for example, some password to handle file access. So, for example, you could decide that you want, in addition to having your friends be in a certain category, that they can only access particular bits of information on your social networking profile only by a password. You could use, in order to define your discretionary access control policy, you could use, for example, a capability list. A capability list just says something like, I am a user, I want to grant access to these numbers of people, here is what I want them to do. I want them, for example, this category of users to only be able to read the information. I want this other category of users to be able to read and sometimes modify the information, and so on. We look in particular at access control lists because they are a simple mechanism for how discretionary access control policies are implemented, and rather quite nice to look at. So with access control lists, what happens is that you have, in general, categories that represent, for example, the owner. So you as the owner, for example, own all of the media that you have, whether that is in terms of photographs, whether it's in terms of text, and whether it's in terms of maybe, for example, other media that you have. So, for example, video. And then you have groups like, for example, your really, really good friends, your not so really good friends, and you want to have different characterizations for these groups. And then you have public information, so information that anybody looking at your profile would see. So, for example, on Facebook again, you see this when you are able to search for somebody and you can see, for example, their name and maybe a picture of them, but nothing else. With the access control list, we could have, for example, representations such as R for read, W for write, M for modify, and computationally, how this would be represented would be, for example, to say, if you're allowed to read, then this is represented by 1, because computationally, we represent information in binary form. So information is represented in terms of 1s and 0, because binary numbers have a span of only 0 to 1. So you could say, if you're allowed to read, you have a 1. If you're not allowed to read, it's 0. So you see that, for example, in the first column, the owner is allowed to read, to write, and to modify, so we have it all at 1. The public is only allowed to read, so they have read at 1 and W and M at 0. Okay. So with access control list, the advantage, for example, is that it's simple and effective to use. All you have to do is from your system, make contact with the server, and then the server will check the access control list to see if you're authorized to read this information, and then it will give you what you're allowed to see, following the rules that we just described. Okay. The disadvantage, as I was just explaining to you, is that first of all, you can have cases of transitive disclosure. So I disclose information to a really good friend, and my really good friend inadvertently discloses this information to some person whom I would not like the information to be disclosed to. And this happens because of the definition of the access control policies, what you grant, what you don't allow. So for example, on Facebook, you can say, I want this information to be accessible to my friends only. And in that case, it's accessible to your friends only. But if you say that the information should be made accessible to your friends and your friends' friends, then you can have transitive disclosures. Okay? And then you want to, when you look at all of this, the problem of the difficulties also arises not only for this transitive disclosures, but also for cases, for example, of defining these friendship groups. So think, for example, when you begin your friendship profile definitions, you have groups of friends of maybe 10, but when you get 1,000 friends, it becomes more difficult to assign categories manually correctly. Okay. So it's very difficult for you, for example, to make specifications in correct ways so that nobody whom you don't want to have access to a particular file has access to that file. And what it needs, therefore, is that you be more careful, pay more attention. So when you get a friendship request, the easiest thing to do is to click accept the friendship. But when you do that, think about in what category you want to have this friend and what information you want them to see about you, because this is important. Information that you post on social media is held for a very long time and can be dragged up and shown about you in the future. So you want to be careful about what you post and what you publish about yourself. Next time we are going to talk about privacy policies. Privacy policies are important because they build on access control policies. And as we said before, access control policies build on passwords, and all of this is building progressively towards talking about things, talking about what you should do in order to protect your profile effectively.